presentations fit very well together because I will be talking more about the very early period of Ukrainian statehood. Professor Gustafsson will be talking more about the last year or so, and maybe later today we will have some opportunity to fill in between these two periods. Perhaps my presentation will be a little bit more theoretical, but it's about some thinking and some theories that are based on a lot of actual research that I did in the past, and I will bring that in a bit later. So the question is, Ukraine 2015, trying to understand the challenges Ukraine is facing and its ability or lack thereof to face these challenges. And I will be talking about that, trying to discuss how do we interpret the weakness or perceived weakness of the Ukrainian state, why looking at 1991 is key for understanding 2015, and then I will finish by discussing what this means for Ukraine today. But basically, the situation we see in Ukraine today tells us a story of external aggression, but also tells us a story of, even after the Euromaidan, a story of continued lack of trust in the state, a story of continued weakness of state institutions, a story of continued weak governance, which clearly affects Ukraine's ability to respond to external aggression. So the question is, how do we interpret this weakness? Not simply in 2015, but this weakness as it has affected Ukrainian statehood since 1991. And let us remember that whatever extremes and excesses we saw during the Yanukovych regime were in one or another manner also present throughout all the years of Ukrainian statehood, whether we like it or not. That is the reality. Some have sought to understand this weakness by looking at the role of external actors. Obviously, as a specialist on energy, I have read gazillion books on Russian energy aggression and on Russian use of economic means of pressure. More specifically, those dealing with Ukrainian politics have tried to explain this weakness by looking at the issue of structures, some research on the impact of old Soviet structures that remained active, legally active in Ukraine in the first years after independence. The Verkhovna Rada, the old Soviet constitution that was enforced for a couple of years after independence. Others have looked at the issue of actors, at the apparent inability of Ukrainian elites to live up to the historical challenge of leading a new state. And some of these ideas come together through the concept of a flawed foundational bargain. Kuzio, Fanson have talked about this, a foundational bargain in which Ukrainian elites in 1990, 1991 acquiesced to Ukrainian independence in exchange for, if I were to quote them, the ability or the opportunity to continue stealing from this new political formation. So I'm trying to make sense of this. I'm trying to make sense of this and trying to see, well, is there any way to move beyond that dichotomy, structures, actors? So what have I learned through the work I did on energy? So I wrote 2 books on energy, corruption, and stuff. Maybe you know them. The important point here is that what can we learn from that that can help us reassess that weakness of the Ukrainian state, and in particular, those debates about a foundational bargain in Ukraine. And the first thing I learned through all that research on those books is that Russian-centered explanations of Ukrainian issues or problems are not sufficient. If we look at the case of energy, we see that in as much as Russia has sought to use energy as a weapon, a very big part of the story also has to do with domestic governance. And one of my books deals with energy corruption and how it made it impossible for Ukraine to develop its own energy policy until up to 2006. But you also learn from that research that when you have large amounts of rents suddenly available, exactly during the very first years of statehood of a new state, this has a humongous impact on those states' political development. And I also learned that the domestic distribution of these rents, in this case energy rents, will also affect how those political systems, or in the case of Ukraine, that political system will develop. And finally, I also learned that in the various countries I studied, but also in the case of Ukraine, post-Soviet actors seem to favor informal bilateral relationships with Russia that allowed for certain lack of transparency to continue instead, or as alternatives to more organized or formal arrangements. So what I'm trying to do in this paper is, well, what would happen if we try to look at the question of foundational bargains, but putting at the center some issues which sometimes remain simply in the background, are not discussed directly, which is the incentives for certain elite behaviors that were there at the very time of those foundational bargains. And if one of the reasons those rents were so important was because they took place exactly at the time of the establishment of the state, then maybe there is something exactly about this period, 1991, 1992, 1993, that deserves closer analysis. And what I try to develop in this paper and a couple of other papers dealing with other post-Soviet states is that there was a specific confluence of factors coming together at this time, which is going to come together to create opportunities for rent seeking. I call this rent swamps because a swamp bogs you down. Situations where there's significant amount of rents which are easily available and in very large amounts. And you can think of a couple of other historical cases, with the consequence that rent seeking is spreading, hindering an anti-corruption movements. Some of this is not very original. If you know the work of Mr. Oleg Havrilishin, he talks a lot about that in his 2006 book as well. So what I try to understand is what is happening in terms of the post-Soviet political economy in this special period, 1991, 1994, 1995, coinciding with the triple transformation: political, state building, economic transformation. And what I found out is that you really have a unique confluence of Soviet legacies, the type of economic policies pursued by Ukraine in these very early years, and also Russia's economic policies here. So very briefly, what kind of policy do we have in mind? In the case of Soviet legacies, pricing policies or non-pricing policies, which meant that key inputs for the economy, in particular gas and oil, were supplied and produced with very little regard to prices, opening the way for arbitrage gains related to the existence of different prices for a single commodity in a single market. We can talk more about that later if you want. Second key Soviet legacy, informational asymmetries, which allowed well-connected actors to have a basis for an easy capture of these new opportunities immediately after Soviet dissolution. Second element, the early policies of the post-Soviet states, in this case Ukraine in particular, and this is something that Oleg Havrilishin also discusses very much, the unique sequencing of reforms whereupon private activity was allowed, was made legal before there was a real price liberalization, again, allowing the continuation of multiple markets for a single good, allowing arbitrage gains to be available and those rents available, together with the availability of administrative resources, making it possible for those with the right connections to access these rents. The third element, Russia's policies, which for a variety of reasons, be it sympathy towards the Slavic brethren, be it the desire to influence the elites, allowed for the continuation of multiple pricing of single commodities by supplying some of these commodities are at low prices to certain segments of the Ukrainian economy. This had a tremendous effect throughout the Ukrainian economy in terms of the types of rents that were available. I'm not going to go into that. The combined effect of the availability, accessibility, and impunability of access to these rents created negative synergies, preventing both policy reform, i.e. a real energy policy, and governance reform. So, since I think I'm almost about to say goodbye, what does this mean for Ukraine today? It means that some of the basis for those governance deficits continue to be there. It means that the lack of trust in the state continues to make it difficult for Ukraine to face external aggression, and that there continues to be a danger of a new crisis of political legitimacy. But there's a second element of what this means for Ukraine. And when I go back to my broader thinking on the rent swamps of the post-Soviet transition, I have also done some research on other states, Transnistria, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, de facto post-Soviet state formations, with their own way of forming rent swamps. And I'm very afraid, very worried, that some of these situations are being repeated in the Luhansk and Donetsk republics in a way in which manipulation of boundaries, of borders, may create synergies, not for the resolution of the conflict, but for those entities accruing resources for the entity, first and foremost for their elites, but in a way that supports the continuation of the conflict by turning it into a mutually profitable stalemate and not a hurting stalemate, and that makes me very worried. Thank you.